lands earlier did no such thing. So Native peoples' lands remained in that taxable status and continues to lead to loss of native lands via taxation, even in 2025. This is not something over and done with. With the establishment of the Mass Commission on Indian Affairs in 1974, there were some positive advocacy efforts, the creation of the Native tuition waiver, representation of Native peoples to various committees as it impacts protection of Native ancestors. But one of the things that the Commonwealth did not do, which many other states chose to do, was the creation of an Indian Housing Authority. This became a viable option and opportunity in 1977 due to changes within public housing laws at the federal level. And those states that created Indian housing authorities were able to provide new infusions of federal dollars to states for affordable housing, home ownership program, infrastructure and capacity building programs for tribes. Again, that happened in 1977. The state did not create that housing authority, so there were a decade before the Aquinnah-Wampanoag tribe was able to access federal housing dollars. It was in 2007, from 1977, and before the Mashpee tribe was able to access federal Indian housing dollars, and the other Native communities still cannot access federal Indian housing dollars because of that policy decision made in 1977. And that window remained open from 1977 to about 1996, and now that door is closed. And when we think about and heard from Native participants in this study what they had to say, it was pretty straightforward. The effects of colonialism, racism, and policies such as both the Allotment Act here and we involved Native peoples who were impacted by the federal Dawes Allotment Act still impact them in 2025. One of the focus group participants from a tribal community native to Massachusetts said, "I want everybody to look at what was taken from us in terms of the land, our territory, our homelands. We can't build our communities and our families when things have been taken from us. We can't pass it on. We don't have generational wealth like others do because we're already behind that 8-ball, because things, I'm going to say, were and are being taken from us." And that's the firsthand account and experience of the ongoing impacts of policies like the Massachusetts Enfranchisement and Allotment Act. Now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Allison Taylor, who will talk about the qualitative methods and data from that portion of the study.
Thank you, Dr. Woods. So as you can see, the past policies and actions of the state and federal government continue to impact Native communities today. There's limited quantitative data available, as Dr. Woods said, but what we do have shows persistent wealth disparities between Native residents of Massachusetts and the overall population. The limited quantitative data was one of the impetus for conducting a qualitative study. We also wanted to hear directly from the Native people that have been impacted, and doing so really did provide us some critical insights into the complexities, into the causes and the impacts, and into some best practices for trying to address those gaps. So what did we do? We conducted 5 90-minute focus groups with a total of 18 individuals. The participants represented 5 regional tribes, as well as one group of folks we call expats, folks from tribes outside the Commonwealth. Aged from 20s into the 70s. We did include a few more elders, so on the older end, so we could really get that historical perspective. And a few more women than men, and one Two-Spirit person was involved in the focus groups. So what did we ask about? Well, we started out, we wanted to ask how they defined wealth, because we didn't want to assume that we were all coming at this idea of wealth from the same perspective. And then we asked about historical factors and also present-day barriers that are affecting wealth, as well as their own personal, familial, and community experiences of wealth and wealth building. And then what would wealth building look like? What does it look like? What would it look like? And then what would be needed in order to do that? So I'll share a few highlights from the report. We really forefront the quotes from the individuals that participated in the focus groups. I do want to encourage you to read the full report because it does give you a more complete picture and delves just more deeply into some of these issues. But I'll give a few main themes that were highlighted in the focus groups. So first, the participants made it clear that Native definitions of wealth are distinct from dominant culture definitions of wealth, and that they're more inclusive, more driven by values and community, and more really tied to community prosperity rather than individual. Also, as Cedric alluded to, land is really central to Native wealth under both of these definitions. Participants also discussed how important education is, and they talked about both access to higher education and quality higher education, as well as financial literacy, and financial literacy that is culturally appropriate and understands, again, these varying definitions of wealth and the historical impacts of the factors that we just discussed. And then in addition to, yes, improving access to education and financial literacy, they did talk about what kinds of structural changes are needed beyond increasing services. So, defining wealth from a Native perspective. So in every single focus group, the participants really did make a distinction between Native definitions of wealth and these dominant culture definitions. They described Native definitions of wealth as more culturally based, more community based, more inclusive, just as they acknowledge that we're all living within a system that prioritizes material wealth and financial wealth. So they talked about how wealth is not just a personal or familial resource, but also a community asset, collective resources, as well as shared traditions and mutual support being very important to that definition. Also emphasized the need for comfort and stability over acquiring massive amounts of material wealth. And then they also talked about culture and community as forms of wealth themselves, so they're not just sites for wealth building, but actually part of the sense of what it means to prosper. So one participant said, financial security, or having a high income, or owning a lot of property, are things that we bring from our perspective as living within the dominant culture. And the idea of cultural wealth and the idea of having enough, and everyone having enough, is something that we bring from the Native culture. And those two things are sometimes diametrically opposed. So the centrality of land to Native wealth was also a key theme in the focus groups. They talked about land not just being a material asset, which it can be, absolutely, but also really core to the cultural, spiritual, and community wealth, and even to the survival of Native people. And as discussed, the state and federal policies ruptured those connections to land. So people aren't living on their ancestral homelands, or if they are, they're paying taxes on them. So one person said, when you can't steward lands and you can't be on lands that are connected and that can sustain us in a traditional way, whether it be for our traditions and food, or whether it be in our practices spiritually or just communally, how do you reconcile that within yourself? How do you heal that relationship with the land, with yourself, if you don't have those opportunities? So they also focused on the need for structural change to begin to repair some of these historical and ongoing harms. So in addition, as I said, to pushing for financial education programs, they identified some key priority policy reforms that could address wealth disparities. And that includes expanding housing access through state-level initiatives, the preservation of tribal lands through tax exemptions or trust agreements. What's critical to any of these efforts is that solutions need to come from the Native communities themselves. So another individual said, there's just such a long historical trauma and stain on our collective consciousness, even over the hundreds of years. We do need to deal with the reality of what has been done to Native people before we can really, really create true opportunities for Indigenous people to have long-term wealth. So as I said, that there's a lot more in the report and a lot more quotes, but I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Phil Granberry to talk a little bit about what we have and what we don't have in terms of quantitative data.
First, a little bit about our quantitative data. They come from the American Community Survey. The American Community Survey is an annual survey that's administered by the U.S. Census Bureau, where the decennial census every 10 years tries to count everyone in households and in group quarters in the United States. The American Community Survey, as its name says, is a survey of around 3% of households. And so it has a range, in other words. It does not have the exact, sample data, and you can actually put a upward and a lower bound on that population. We just report the total for this and not show that bound. Also, something else important about the population, in 1996, the Office of Management and Budget and the Clinton administration set up the guidelines for measuring race and ethnicity in the United States. And it did something very, very interesting that never had been done before. It allowed for what is called 2 or more races. And this becomes very, very important for the American Indian population because if you would actually account for the people in this 2023 American Community Survey, roughly a small number, less than 0.5% of the Commonwealth's population, roughly 22,000 people, identify only as American Indian. Next, though, this directive going back to 1996 by the Office of Management and Budget, we can actually then people who identify with American Indian and another race, which officially the Census Bureau calls 2 or more races. And then that population now jumps up to 77,000. So you can see that even just the measurement of this population, makes it quantitatively a little bit more challenging. Working with Cedric over the past 15, almost 20 years now, that this 2 or more race category becomes very, very important. The first time we worked together was on the 2000 census, and And you can see then the growth of the population becomes much more larger when you account for the 2 or more race category. Okay, with that background on the data, I'll have one slide that actually shows the estimates here, but as you've been hearing is that we don't have an estimate of wealth. In fact, it is very, very hard to get any estimate of wealth for a number of reasons, but also it is very, very difficult to get that measure. How much much wealth do I have? Do I know? I can't report that to you, and I don't think anyone else can. There are surveys that do it, but it does with small sample sizes, and we can't get to any small population like American Indians in Massachusetts. So what we do, and what the survey does, is allow us to use proxies for wealth. So we do know wealth is somewhat correlated with other things, and we can see, and there's somewhat these characteristics then are, household income can be very important for this study, home ownership, because of this, we've been hearing about the access to land and business ownership. Before I get to the next slide, our median household income from the American Indian population is roughly 75,000, let's kind of a rough estimate. And for the non-American Indian population, it's around 100,000. The reason I like those numbers, so it basically says on an income level, the American Indian population earns 75 cents on every dollar to what is earned by the non-American Indian population. And so, as a proxy for wealth accumulation, you can see there's a limitation then on your household income for American Indian population. Education is also something that is highly correlated with wealth accumulation. The American Indian population of Massachusetts are roughly a little less than a third have a bachelor's degree or higher. And compared to the rest of the country, that is very, very good. It's around 36%. But if you compare it to Massachusetts, it's much lower. It is 48% for the Massachusetts population. These are adults aged 25 and older. Next, business ownership is oftentimes thought as a way to accumulate wealth. And we have to be very, very careful with business ownership, because business ownership is also correlated with people's skill level. So I work as a demographer, and so I have a skill level for that. I can't just automatically become an engineer to work in information technology, which would pay me a higher wage, right? I don't have the skill for that. So we oftentimes hear, I think there's a misnomer, and I like to try to demystify it a little bit, that, people just need to start their own businesses, right? If you think that's the way to generate wealth, but you can't, your skill level will determine the type of businesses you start. And so even though the rate of business ownership among the American Indian population is 9% compared to 10% for the general population of Massachusetts, the types of businesses become very, very important. 25% of the American Indian business owners are in accommodation and food services. Accommodation and food services will have lower income, where 25%, almost again a quarter of the non-American Indian population work in much higher paying professional, scientific, and management positions. And so you can see then that all of these kind of proxies that I'm pointing out are showing that we would expect a disparity in wealth accumulation, even though we don't measure that. And so the quantitative data supports what we've heard from the history, from Cedric, and from the interviews that Allison has shown. And one thing in particular, though, I want to point out here is housing. Home ownership, it means ownership of land. And when we think about ownership of land, it is very much tied to what we've heard previously here, that the ownership of land is something that at one time this population owned all of the land, and over time that has shrunk and shrunk for many, many reasons. But what we've kind of heard today is that in the past 100 years, there have been policies that have directly influenced the ownership of the land. Before I get to the data, I'll broaden it even a little bit more. The work I do oftentimes looks at what happened in the 1930s. As Cedric was saying, what happens in the 1930s was oftentimes a response to the Great Depression. And we then developed things called redlining maps. And these redlining maps were in urban areas that really, really shaped the ability for people to own land. So if you look at the city of Boston and those redline maps, they're almost all red. But if you go to Milton, you go to anywhere outside of the city of Boston, I'm pretty sure the highest color was blue, and they're all blue. So in other words, that pattern of redlining affected home ownership in large parts of the United States, and so this would then affect, as an American Indian population would move to cities like Boston, it would affect their ability to own land, right? So I want to connect the home ownership then, and then what we see then is here is the disparity, right? That our native population are more likely to be renters and less likely to be homeowners, and so this pattern then is with a median household income of $70,000, provides a possibility for home ownership, right? There's educational attainment is also, close to a third of the population, that has higher levels of educational attainment measured nationally, pretty much similar. Is that in Massachusetts, our American Indian population has lower home ownership and due in some part to what we've heard here before. So all these together suggest our quantitative measures seem to support what we've heard from our qualitative data, which is a nice fit, of course, for our report. And I want to just kind of broaden that a little bit. That when we look at wealth accumulation, right? Wealth accumulation, it is different than income, and oftentimes it is based upon a historical narrative. I like to tell the story of my own parents. I'm one of 8 children, and my parents must have thought we were going to work on the farm. Why? Because my parents worked on a farm. That farm story becomes very, very important because I was telling you the story. My parents then moved to a city, not Boston, to my own happiness, I never worked a day on the farm. That's hard work, right? And so these 8 children that my parents had would have been thought to be labor, but we became a liability because we had child labor laws. Their parents couldn't make us work. And that story then changes a little bit, because remember I told you my parents who never did farming themselves. My dad was in the military, not the highest of income. When they retired, around the time they retired, they became wealthy. And why did they become wealthy? Because the story I told you at the very beginning, my grandparents owned farms, and they inherited farmland. So I did get the payback. I didn't have to do the work on the land, but I never benefited from the wealth accumulation that my parents did because of ownership of land. So I will close with that. Do you want to do the sum them up? Get that one more? You want to do it? Yeah.
Our conclusions for this are probably things you've already figured out based on the presentations by myself, Dr. Taylor, Dr. Granberry. Native residents in the Commonwealth and everywhere else have important stories to tell. Qualitative approaches combined with quantitative approaches can provide opportunities to center Native voices on the topics of wealth and for other topics. I'd advocate that we do this for any number of areas and disciplines. Native residents' ideas for growing wealth, what we heard directly from them, financial literacy, access to wealth building opportunities, and strengthen community connections are practical and achievable. And again, in conclusion, we hope that this report and the people who participated in it encourages the Commonwealth, our political leaders here on Beacon Hill, reach out and collaborate with Native residents, particularly those impacted by the historical injustices of the Massachusetts Allotment Act and the state's pass on a policy to create pathways via Indian housing funds, as ways to work together towards a more just and inclusive future for Native residents of the Commonwealth. That concludes the formal presentation. We'll now have some questions from the audience. I'll moderate that, and you can ask questions of any of the three of us. Yes, sir.
From Frederick Endicott of Canton, other maps, and one of them is at the University of Massachusetts, along with others, of land in Canton. It's there now, and it has a little box, Indian land, on it. And they haven't cataloged those maps, but they're there. That's a good, because Canton was a punk plantation. And of course, all of it was Indian land or whatnot.
Thank you for sharing that. And you're exactly correct. On the border, the Canton-Stoughton border today, which used to be Dorchester, by the way, in the 17th century when it was originally bounded out, but that was the site of the Ponkapog plantation, where the lineal descendants are frequent partners with us, the Massachusetts tribe at Ponkapog.
Hi, thank you all so much for the presentation. I'm wondering if state-funded programs are all the more important, not only because of the Allotment Act, but also because of the exclusion of Massachusetts tribes, like from federal recognition as well.
I would say that the state, and I'm going to cite a report which is in the report on native wealth, the Earl report. It describes the Commonwealth as having a fiduciary responsibility to tribes in the state at that point in time in 1860 when that report was written. From my perspective, that fiduciary responsibility has never gone away. I'd argue that they broke that fiduciary responsibility when they passed the Allotment Act over the objection of many of the native peoples here. They said, no, we don't want this. This is going to be bad for us. And it was. So yes, I would say that the state has a greater obligation as a result of its direct actions and its inaction from its failure to engage with the federal government with free housing money, new housing money, to support its native residents. And again, this occurred after the establishment on the Mass Commission on Indian Affairs, so obviously they were aware that native people were still here, but they took a pass on accessing services that could have benefited native families greatly here in the Commonwealth.
Hi, thank you so much. Partially as a follow-up to that question, I'm curious, I appreciated the thoughts around ideas for how Massachusetts can help strengthen and grow Native American health. Are there specific solutions that came up, or how would you suggest maybe that the state improve its investment I mean, the idea about a housing authority or a housing program that obviously this state, did not hold up its side of the bargain there. Is there something that they could do now? Like specifics, I guess.
Sure. A couple of things. The tuition waiver, when it was passed, actually did cover the cost of tuition. Now it's more like a discount. I think it's around 15% that it actually covers. That's something that's fully within state control as far as state universities and community colleges are concerned. They could decide that the tuition waiver is going to be a true waiver for eligible American Indian Alaskan natives. I mean, there's already a statute on the books. It's providing direction and allocating resources to the state institutions that would apply for that. That's a very concrete, I would hope, easy thing for the state to do, but not going to hold my breath on that either. So that's one thing. The other aspects in terms of developing culturally appropriate mechanisms for teaching things like financial literacy and access to other wealth building opportunities. There is a Mass Commission on Indian Affairs that has relationships with both Native nonprofits as well as tribal communities in the Commonwealth. You have entities like my institute at UMass Boston that could be funded to grow capacity in any of these areas in direct collaboration with tribal communities. So those are things the state could choose to affirmatively do. And they could also take a look at the ongoing harms that are still occurring as a result of the removal of protections on native lands with the Allotment Act and look at potential redress for those issues as well. I mean, those are three things that come to the top of my mind very quickly.
I actually have a question.
Yes.
I'm curious about, since you all published this report, if you've heard from legislators who are interested in hearing more and figuring out what action items they can take in the legislature.
We have not. And there is not an American Indian caucus focused on American Indian specific issues in the Commonwealth. Other states have them. We don't have one here.
Thank you. Other questions?
Is the commission helping push this report out inside and outside?
There
Since
were
that's
two
one of the-
commissioners who provided a response to the formal presentation on this report in January, not in their roles as commissioners, but in their roles as community members, but who also sit on the commission. So I'd say they're keenly aware of it, and I'd say that they certainly have shared it. But again, this is where numbers matter. Our numbers are relatively small in the Commonwealth, and we have not had very vocal, very active advocates here at Beacon Hill. We've had some. Former Representative Byron Rushing, Mel King actually pushed for the tuition waiver to become a thing. So those are two that I think of immediately, and there are some that are pushing other aspects of the Mass Indigenous Legislative Agenda around the State Seal and Flag Commission, the mascot issue in public schools, but not around these issues. And I think that this is a much broader issue than the specific ones we've talked about. But I'd be happy to have a conversation with anyone, any of our state elected officials in relation to this report. And I'm sure my colleagues would as well. That's why we're here today. We're not getting paid to be here. We don't get parking passes. I have to pay to get a Lyft or Uber here or take mass transit. But we're here because it's important to us. Question up front.
I just had a question about sort of what you guys are doing on the, maybe like the website of it. Is there a website that we can visit? Are there forms that are being filled out by people who agree in your message?
We don't have a dedicated web page to this other than what Boston Indicators has. So I'm not leading a mobilization effort. I wasn't joking that we do what we get paid to do. We're able to do this report because the Boston Foundation, Boston Indicators paid for it, and the rest of my time's allocated to other funded projects. So I don't have a separate advocacy page for this, although if I had voluminous free time, it would be a great thing to set up to try to push a particular agenda, but that's not something that we have at present.
Thank you.
Okay, if that's it, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Allison. Thank you, Phil, for taking time out of your day.
Thank you, Cedric, Allison, and Philip, for this enlightening conversation, and I hope you hear back from more legislators. It was a pleasure to have you all here today on a very important topic. I want to let you know that we have another author talk coming up in December 10th with author Paul Collins, and it is Supreme Bias, Gender and Race in U.S. Supreme Court Confirmation Hearings. Thank you all. Have a good day.